Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Data Science Hangout. I'm Rachel. I lead customer marketing at POSIT, and I'm so excited to have you joining us today. I was just saying today I'm calling in from Montreal, so a bit different. But the Hangout is our open space to hear what's going on in the world of data across different industries, chat about data science leadership, and connect with others facing similar things as you. We get together here every Thursday at the same time, same place. If this is your first time joining us, it is so nice to meet you. If it is anybody's first data science hangout, we'd love to have you say hi in the chat so we can welcome you in as well. We're all dedicated to keeping this a friendly and welcoming space for everyone and love hearing from you no matter your years of experience, your titles, industry, or languages that you work in. It's totally okay for you to just listen in here too. Maybe you're out walking your dogs or in a coffee shop, but also awesome to be part of the party that happens in the Zoom chat. So I love seeing all the resources and links that are shared there too. There's also 3 ways that you can jump in and ask questions or provide your own perspective on certain topics. So first off, you can just raise your hand on Zoom and I'll keep an eye out and call on you to jump in and ask your question. You could put questions in the Zoom chat and just put a little star next to it if it's something you want me to read instead. Otherwise, I'll just call on you to ask it. And then third, we have a Slido link where you can ask questions anonymously. And I'm sure someone from the POSIT team will share that in the chat right now. I do like to just add, we do have a LinkedIn group for the Hangouts. If you'd like to join that, it can often make it a bit easier to find some people that you might meet here in the chat too. And a quick note that if you are watching the recording at some point in the future and want to join us live, the link to add it to your calendar will be in the details below. And there's no rule that anybody has to stay the whole time or talk, come and go as it fits your schedule. But with that, I am so excited to be joined by my 2 co-hosts today, Kevin and Raju. Kevin is Associate Director of Nonclinical Informatics, and Raju is Data Scientist at the FDA. And I'd love to have you both maybe just kick things off with introducing yourselves, sharing a little bit about your role, but also something you like to do outside of work too.
I'll go first. So I'll start with what I like to do outside of work. So that's, I don't know, more
I
fun.
love that you're starting with that's the first. I think that's the first time ever.
Oh, yeah, I don't want to forget. No, I really, let's see, I really like to play music. I play bass guitar, mandolin, guitar, I'm learning banjo. All my kids, everyone has a ukulele in my family. The kids don't really play as much as I wish, but but yeah, I think that's a big part of my life is playing music, and I'm into like jazz and bluegrass and Grateful Dead and all that kind of stuff. So all right, and then what do I do for work? So I think I wanted to give a little background, like kind of how I got to where I am. Just to give context. So I got my doctorate in neuroscience, and I was studying how stress affects cognition in rats. And I did a little bit of MATLAB programming and was playing around with like this machine learning model to model their behavior, which I thought was a lot of fun, but my project really wasn't funded for that. I think I would have needed way more rats to like have the model converge, fitting their parameters and their data. I really enjoyed that. And then I did a short postdoc after grad school, learning bioinformatics stuff, doing RNA-seq data analysis, where I learned how to program in R and Python and shell scripting. And then I got a job soon after at FDA, originally in CDRH and devices, in vitro diagnostics for for infectious diseases, basically. So if I was still there, I would have been flooded with all the COVID applications for EUAs. But luckily, I and ended up moving on to CDER shortly after. I had a little project there where we were trying to figure out how do you regulate next generation sequencing as an infectious disease diagnostic. So there's some kind of bioinformatics research stuff there. But then I moved to CDER as a toxicology reviewer. So that reviewing animal toxicology studies that we conduct primarily before testing in humans, although we continue to conduct them as we test longer durations in humans. And yeah, I was doing the therapeutic area of like pain and anesthesia and addiction. That was more neuroscience. Yeah, I wanted to get back to that. And right around the time that I joined as a toxicologist, we started, the FDA was gearing up to start receiving structured data sets with these toxicology studies. Before that, it was just the study reports on PDF and actually paper not so long ago. But with getting data sets for these studies, that opened up, that opens up a lot of possibilities of interesting things we can do with cross-study analysis to understand the background rates of findings, or really look across large volumes of data and make better policy decisions and understand our policies better. And so I started volunteering on projects to do whatever I could with these data sets, because I had this background that most of the other toxicologists really had no need to know how to program, because it was never really a thing in regulatory toxicology. And then eventually I was lucky enough to get a position created for I think actually I told my current boss at some point, I was just like, if I could do this like stuff I'm volunteering full time, like I would do that. And then about a year later, she came to me and was like, I have an FTE position for you to do that, because she was kind of under a lot of pressure. She's basically runs the policy shop for the Pharm Tox review program, and there's a lot of questions and policies that she has. We have trouble answering because we don't have great handle on our data, and so for the past 4 or 5 years, I've been in that position where I just do data science and informatics projects to support data-driven policy development for Pharm Tox, and luckily I also have some ORISE fellows, some postdocs, where we do different research into developing different methods of working with this data, which then we can publish. And I'm trying to grow kind of not just the FDA, but with the industry as well, kind of this open source consortium effort to utilize this data effectively and build standard tools, because we have standard data.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that intro, Kevin. And I see Mike is starting a data science hangout band in the chat as well.
Nice.
Maybe he'll perform at the POSIT conference in August. Raju, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Raju Rayavarapu, and I guess my main arc is going to be the data science work and stuff that I do is just sort of something that I discovered as like a passion and a love sort of thing. But to stick to Kevin's pattern here, I'm going to start with something fun, and then I'll give you guys my background here. So what I do for fun is in the last few years, especially since like, the COVID stuff, I've started to make a mission of like learning one new sort of life skill, as I've been calling them. So like a couple of years ago, I learned how to like ride motorcycles, got my motorcycle license. But this year I'm doing horseback riding, and I'm getting better at ice skating, because as my partner, who's a fabulous ice skater, likes to point out, using inertia to stop, like hitting like a wall to stop, isn't like the best way to stop. So I've been like, getting those skills up. But I'm a big fan of being outside and doing things. Like I'll be usually outside with my telescope if I can find time with my dogs to do that. So my background is a little similar to Kevin, but a little different from Kevin. So I'm a PhD molecular biologist and biochemist. And so, I did a lot of wet lab work. I spent most of my time, looking at cell death mechanisms and looking at, signaling pathways that govern cell death, particularly in like metastatic biology. And then from there, I went to St. Jude, where I worked on autophagic regulation and metabolic regulation, and a little bit of autophagy for death. But while I was there, I got kind of interested in trying to figure out what the government and what industry and government and academia can do together, which led to a role at the FDA looking at public-private partnerships. And when I'd come into the agency, I'd done a little bit of scripting work. My dad's a computer programmer, so like I was just kind of exposed to it at all times. But I never really wanted to do that, because when I was a kid, I was like, I don't want to do the same thing my dad does, right? Like it's kind of you sometimes take that like hard line away. but I did engage with some of these programmatic tools. I learned how to code in Visual Basic a long time ago so that I could play asteroids, just really weird stuff like that. And then I used a little bit of R when I was working on high throughput screening data to make better plots and all that fun stuff that you can't necessarily do with Excel. But when I'd come to the FDA, I'd been just serendipitously sitting next to a friend who's a fabulous Python programmer. He's a semantic web expert. And I was explaining my project to him, and it was like, hey, instead of doing it via basic methodologies and using just generating a static output, he's like, why don't you learn Python? It's not that, you'll pick it up. It's not that hard. He's like, it's kind of like a gateway towards a lot of other stuff. So I started dabbling with Python and R, and I started working on building dashboards and doing things like, doing web scraping and doing auto matching of concepts and terms and modeling and all this fun stuff for text. From there, I ended up being picked up by the Center for Tobacco Products that had a lot of data that they were working with that was unstructured, and I spent a lot of time working on automation methodologies to structure their unstructured data. And while doing that, I was elected as co-chair of the Scientific Computing Board, along with my friend, Dr. Jamie Pettingill, who's also awesome, and I don't know if he's on the call. And so Jamie and I get to essentially advocate on behalf of the scientific and research computing staff at the agency and their needs, and what kinds of interesting technologies and tools that they want or have access to, and ensuring that that is represented in a meaningful way. I also then was picked up by the Office of Data Analytics and Research, which is the FDA's Chief Data Officer shop. And I'm a lead data scientist in there, helping establish some of their data science pipelines, some of their analytics pipelines. And I get to work with fabulous individuals. I just saw my colleague Megan Merriman pop into chat here, doing that, working on some of these analytics activities. And I get to just hang out with some really cool data science folk. I like to say that I kind of fell into this sort of field, but I was lucky enough to find some wonderful individuals that I get to work with, and that's kind of my background. So yeah. I'm gonna if it's all right with you, Rachel, I might hop into some of the intro stuff, or
Yeah, well, I was gonna first ask if you both wouldn't mind giving us some context about what data science looks like across the organization. Like, I know there's so many different teams, and I know there's this data science and software development working group as well, and I thought it would be good to understand a bit more about what that means.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was gonna hop into.
Oh,
So that's
perfect.
perfect.
No, that's
Perfect. So the main, one of the big driving forces at the FDA is that FDA is really pushing forward this model of IT strategic development and IT strategic modernization, and one of the big pieces of that is data literacy and data talent. And so Kevin, myself, Alexis, and many of the people on the call, Tomas, we get to work in this space where we're working on data talent and data literacy, which is a driving force for, again, FDA's IT modernization plan and IT strategy, which, you can look it up. It's out in the FDA.gov space. With that, I'm actually going to pass to Kevin to give some background on the data science community work that kind of spurred on many of the activities that myself and Kevin and a lot of us get to work on.
Sure, yeah. So I'm talking a little bit about the DSSD, Data Science and Software Development Working Group, which really started when Raju and we saw this talk. I forget the name of the guy. He was from the University of Buffalo Medical System, and he gave this awesome talk on how they were doing all this great informatics work, and they seem to really have not just their data organized, but also the infrastructure to support analysis. And me and Raju were talking to him and kind of just complaining about how difficult it was at FDA to do good data science work. And a lot of times you feel like you're doing it behind the back of IT, like they don't really want you to be doing this, but you're like, well, this is actually good for the organization, so I'm going to do it anyway. But there wasn't a lot of guidance or a lot of support for doing that kind of work. And we caught the ear of one of the more senior staff, this guy, Mark Walderhug, who's awesome in CBER. And he was kind enough to kind of pull some strings behind the scenes and set up this cross-agency working group that he told me and Raju to then go ahead and lead. And so we, went through our emails and found all the people that we knew across, we tried to get at least a couple of people from every center that was doing data science work. And we told them all to like join this meeting and let's get together and start, figuring out how to support each other. And basically the way we approached it, in order to kind of bring people into the fold of really being actively involved, we decided to create 3 different work streams, so we could give leaders to each of those work streams, a couple leaders to each of them, and then we had this kind of group of about 9 people who were like core people that were invested. And so we set up a community work stream, an infrastructure work stream, and a process work stream, with the idea that the community work stream would be an opportunity to would focus on bringing people together. The one thing we've always aspired to, we had a little trouble getting this consistently, is to have office hours, where someone hosts it, where someone who knows something about some aspect of data science can host an office hours and people can ask them questions, kind of like this type of venue. We've also just in general had lots of presentation opportunities for people to present their work and discuss it. We did a hackathon at one point, which was really fun. We formed some teams of people to try to solve problems together. The infrastructure work stream was something actually Raju spearheaded that, where we just tried to take a survey of what are all the platforms available, because the different centers at FDA kind of have siloed systems sometimes, and not everybody knows what's available to each other. And so we were able to get a survey where everyone could say, what platforms are you using, which HPC and which center, which, I don't know, just what's the IT support or structures or platforms that you use, and that was really helpful to get all that collated, and then we could kind of pass that off to really we started this group like the month that the chief data officer started at the agency, and so that was convenient too, because he kind of was interested in what we were doing, and it was a good window for him into what data science community was doing. And we've been able to pass off a lot of stuff from a lot of the kind of grassroots stuff that we collect or build. We're able to kind of pass off to his office to try to formalize or make enterprise level. And then the process work stream was the idea was to build best practices. We had aspirations to build these documents of best practices, which we never really got around to, but we did do a lot of good trainings. Like we've got some good recordings on trainings on Git and some basic R and Python stuff. The documentation we found, I think there's so much good documentation on the internet already. It probably wasn't worth our time to create, and so we didn't. Hopefully that's the reason we didn't. But yeah, those are kind of the main things that we did. And and there's one other project that we did. Sorry, my cell phone is acting up. It's messing up with my headphones. Okay. We did this SWAT teams pilot where we'd take a problem, like a real problem that somebody had in the DSSD or someone they knew had, and we asked them to put it out there to the group and ask for volunteers to come together and try to solve it. And then Raj going to talk more about how we've kind of passed this idea off to the chief data science office, the ODAR office, to formalize this. But this, some examples of things, during the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a group that was trying to organize data related to that, and we were able to provide some volunteers to support that. And another thing, this was like a simple thing, but I think it was a good example. There was a group in CDISC-SEND, so the foods part of FDA, where they're tracking economic adulteration cases, and they had like this Excel, they're using Excel to track all these cases. And they were like, this is probably not the best way to do it. And we were able to build a pretty simple but effective, R Shiny app where you just throw it into a DT table and put some UI stuff so that you can use control terminology to select inputs and things like that, so that when you populate this simple table, at least everything's you have your options that you're supposed to use very clearly designated. You can store it in a on a server so that it's not like passed around between people's computers. And that was the kind of thing. I think that template of taking, somebody has some information in Excel, moving it to a DT table and putting some UI around it, that's like a really common use case where it ends up feeling a lot more powerful for the end user than what they had before.
Amazing how much time you can save somebody or how much better you can make their workday by just giving them that tool. I know
Yeah.
Russ had a question in the chat about like who your customers are internally. Russ, do you want to jump in and expand on that one?
Sure. I work in business as opposed to the kind of stuff you people are doing. So I'm always customer focused. And so I'm curious, who is your customer? If not maybe the immediate, maybe down the road, is this for like a pharmaceutical or a hospital, or who is your ultimate customer?
So
Go ahead, Raju.
yeah, I was actually going to answer that question. I saw it and I figured I'd just do it when it came off mic, right? Off of mute here. So our customer varies depending on, the pipeline that we're either implementing or utilizing. Sometimes, the customer is internal folk that have some sort of data related issue that might be that, to the people that are dunking on Excel in the chat here, right? Sometimes they have large data sets that they can't handle because they are sort of using Excel. So we'll come in and help them kind of do some quick analysis, and that'll be like an internal one-off. We also collaborate with and work with across agencies, right? Like we'll work with other agency partners, and so if they have a data need and we're the data repository for that, we'll work with them and generate either reports for them or produce data tables or data sheets that we can turn out. And realistically, it depends on the activity that we're tackling, who our customer ends up being. But if you need like a single word for it, it would be anybody within the FDA and any of our agency partners and sometimes external partners that require some sort of data assistance or data activity from us. Kevin works in, say, the Center for Drugs, and he does a lot of work for the Center for Drugs people that have data related issues. I work at the chief data officer shop, so we tend to work on some things that may be across centers, not to say that we don't focus on a specific center. So I know that may not have been the most satisfying answer, but that's kind of, I think, a good way to think about it. Kevin?
Sure. Yeah, I would chime in that, like, yeah, I think a lot in general, the FDA is obviously serving the American public, and a lot of our interactions, our kind of customers are like the sponsors who are applying for approval of their clinical trials or their products, but a lot of the reviewers are kind of the end users who are interacting directly with sponsors and making regulatory decisions. Those aren't typically data science people, and so yeah, what Raju is saying, a lot of the data scientists at FDA are kind of serving those review regulatory people by feeding them data and tools to utilize data better so that they can support their customers outside better. And then I think we do try to do some public facing projects as well. And like I was saying, I'm very interested in developing open source methodologies for the type of data that we review that sponsors send to us. And in that sense, I'm hoping it's not even just a customer thing, that if I create some software, I'm hoping that we'll get contribution. And so far, I've been able to participate in consortiums and get not just serve things to the sponsors, but to actually have a back and forth, where we're building together.
I wanted to ask you both this question because I've heard it come up quite a bit. It seems like there could be some misunderstanding across the community about support for open source within the FDA, because I've heard a lot of people ask questions even in the Hangouts about using languages like R and Python in your submissions to the FDA. And I would just love to chat about that a little bit and see maybe what other follow-up.
Yeah, I mean, neither of us are in like the biostats reviewer positions. Who those are the folks who really would be receiving those kinds of submissions. I think there is, from my perspective, from what I probably should have said this at the very beginning. As an FDA first, I have to say the disclaimer. These are my thoughts and views. Nothing I say here, nothing I've said here represents the agency policy. But from my perspective, I think there's been a lot of infrastructure built around SaaS in the industry and FDA, and changing that infrastructure over causes friction. And there's not it's a process to, you know, things are built around expecting things to be the way they were when they were set up, even the submission process. And so it takes some work to change that. I think a lot of people in FDA see the value of open source, but I think modernizing the review and submission processes it takes a lot of work to make sure that you can't break it while you're fixing it. You know, you have to keep it running. You have to keep the plane flying while you're building it, you know?
Yeah. And to add to that disclaimer, right? These are my opinions and thoughts as well. But the interesting thing is that is kind of a misconception. And and it could be that there was either and here's how I'll tackle this one, right? I'm a big proponent of using open source technologies and tools, just much like Kevin, as well as many of my FDA colleagues that are on the call here, because it gives us flexibility, and it's honestly can be viewed as an industry standard technology platform. And so I'm gonna split this question in two and answer one of the questions that somebody asked about how we're doing data science work and data science upskilling work at the agency. And so following up on the stuff that Kevin was talking about with the data science and software development working group and the SWAT teams and all these things that we had worked on together, we were able to spin up a program in the office of the chief data officer called Data Forward. And the Data Forward initiative is essentially trying to increase data literacy and data skill tool usage at the agency. And what we actually focus on is, because there is such a strong community of our users at the FDA, we actually give people the opportunity to learn how to use R and RStudio and Shiny to actually do some work. And that's not from any perspective other than we have people that use it, and it's something that we can get people spun up into fairly quickly. And the way that we do it is we will pull together either a project that is FDA relevant, or we'll pull together an FDA relevant data set, and we're piloting a new program where we're going to attempt to just do a self-learning with meetings with the FDA data science community to get your questions answered internally, and so that you can hash out what packages are the best or what methods are the best. But the idea being, with this process, we give people exposure to things like, Tidy, if that's something that they want to use, TidyR and Tidyverse, and they become a little bit more capable at writing their own scripts to do their own data analytics and data analysis, and can go back to their home offices and function as, the data science advisors, mentors, or the actual scripters. But also it makes it easier for them to sort of look out into the universe and see what the best tools that are being utilized by whether it be academia, whether it be industry, are, and become a little bit better at sort of bringing those technologies in and actually working with them. So that misconception is an interesting one, but as many of the people on this call can tell you, we use R, we use Python, we use the best tool for the job that we can find, and we'll implement it as necessary.
So would you say it's been through this community building that you're starting to remove some of the open source panic that may have normally or may have existed before?
Yeah, I think that there's both a cultural shift as well as there is this idea of this open source community, right? I can't understate how much, rather I can't overstate, and I want to make sure it's not understated, that when I came into the agency, I got lucky and was sitting next to a very kind individual that was willing to teach me and take time to teach. And then I met people like Kevin, Alexis, Dave, all these people that were willing to take the time to sort of walk you through something. And so we started building that community, and from that community, we were able to show that, hey, actually, there is a lot of this literacy that exists, and there's a lot of interest to learn this stuff. And as more people start to use tools like R and Python and other open source technologies, it's sort of this ground up sort of acceptance. And from a top down perspective, there has been some cultural shifts and changes that have kind of helped push us forward. Bringing on a chief data officer was a really big and helpful thing, because he's very data forward individual, right? Thinking from a data forward perspective. So yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, let me scroll through a few of the questions. I see Eric, you just asked a question pretty recently in the chat. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel, and I'm really happy to have you guys on. I've been involved in a few of the ARC consortium pilots for submissions, and we've had great success up to this point. I will be transparent for those. One of the biggest challenges has been the infrastructure side of things, where in the ideal situation, the development environment that we do on this pilot team, we could have a one-to-one kind of representation with what our FDA reviewers would have for these submissions. But we have learned through Paul Schutte and others that it's quite variable with people running things on their respective laptops. And, we have to have very detailed instructions on installing the RM environment and getting the Shiny app bootstrap and all that. We're working on ways to make that easier, but I will admit it does make the lack of a centralized type of infrastructure for the FDA reviewers to kind of hit at in one central place a bit difficult for sponsors to navigate through that. Obviously, it's not an easy to solve problem, but it sounds like you both have appetite for trying to help with the infrastructure side of things. Just curious what your perspectives are on how that can get better sometime, hopefully with some enough traction in your organization.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Eric. Good question. I think I want to preface by saying, kind of reiterating that again, me and Raju are not really, like, our day jobs aren't really in the biostats community of, receiving these coded submissions, the SAS code and potentially R code, hopefully more and more R code. But, so, like Paul Schutte, somebody like that would be a better, representative to really field this question specifically. I think what I can say, and I apologize for kind of redirecting, but I don't want to overstep my knowledge or expertise, or but I'd kind of want to redirect it to the stuff that we're doing, me and Raju. It's more enabling scientists who aren't statisticians for the most part to utilize open source to do their jobs more efficiently, to do their science better, or even admins, even to do administrative things better. We're really, I think there's, from my perspective, there's less inertia to fight against when you're putting a solution where nothing was in place than if you're changing the solution from SAS to R. If you're talking to people who've never done any data science, there's so much low-hanging fruit, and there's fairly little resistance to move in that direction. And so I think that's where our efforts end up flowing, because the statisticians, they know how to do data, they know how to do statistics, and they know how to work with data, and they might have their ways that they've been doing it, and it's harder to change minds and reach people from that position than the lower hanging fruit of people who are just like, oh my God, like I've been doing this thing in Excel and I can save so much time, and I can get better insights, and I can generate, I can automate, and I can do better visualization, and I can communicate better. Those are the people who are more receptive, and where we find kind of more headway. I don't know, Raju, do you want anything to that?
No, I think that's, exactly it. I mean, again, Paul Schutte is a fabulous individual, and I was glad to hear his name come up, because he's, an incredible person that we get to work with on the day-to-day. But yeah, most of the stuff that we've been focusing on is attempting to enable those that have either little experience or an experience in another piece of technology, and providing them with, an additional tool set, and again, connectivity to this FDA data science network, so that they can do things like, whether it be, automating a daily task, to actually being able to finally tackle a data project that they previously couldn't. And the example that I use, and I use this example a lot when we're working through with the upskilling teams, is I was once posed a question, and it was on a small team with others. There were three of us. We were posed a question where a team thought that X was the outcome, and it was purely because they couldn't handle the mass amount of data that they had to essentially mine through to get to what they needed. But using a tool that, and again, I was using Python, so using Python, we were able to say, hey, actually the answer is something else, purely because we were able to bring all that data together and then show them that actually, like, we were able to correct their hypothesis. And from there, some of the people that were on that project have gone on to then be able to take and they've actually shifted to R because of the whole it was easier to get them R&R Studio at the agency. Like, we were able to shift them to that, and now they do that analysis themselves, right? It was essentially an experiment in demonstrating what the value of these tools are like, and saying, hey, actually, this provides you with a little bit more capability than you had before. These were folk that would not traditionally have been exposed to these technologies, that now, when exposed, they kind of found some joy in it and they move forward with it. So
yeah, I actually had one more thought I wanted to add. This is a little more CDER specific, and probably still not the satisfying what you wanted answered, but something from my position, right? I'm in like the non-clinical toxicology space, and it's a space where there hasn't been traditionally enormous biostat support. And the nature of this data is exploratory. It's not powered. We do like 3 to 10 animals per sex per group, and we measure like 100, 150 endpoints. It's exploratory safety data, right? And so we don't the convenient. So there's some convenient things from a data science perspective about that, is that we don't have pre-specified endpoints. We don't really have to worry. You can do data exploration and it's valid because that's how the study was designed. And so but the one thing I can say, as I kind of try to build more infrastructure and support for doing better data science in the non-clinical safety area, I think there is potential in the clinical safety area. I've been looking into doing more kind of translational, like, can we organize our data better to understand, relationship between non-clinical and clinical safety findings? Because they're really, in some ways, they're looking at different things, or pulling different endpoints. But in general, again, I'm not a clinician, I'm not an MD, I don't do clinical data review, but from what I've seen, the safety data analysis is a little bit more exploratory. It's not as pre-specified, and I think there's room there for more kind of data science innovation than maybe whereas the efficacy endpoints, there's so much work that's been done, whether it was SAS or R. The work that goes into the statistical analysis of efficacy endpoints is really hard work. Like, people like there's not as, I don't think there's as much room for advancement as there is in the safety space. It seems like there's some low-hanging fruit. I don't know. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I know you gave a generic example of one of these, but I'm wondering, is there a favorite low-hanging fruit use case that comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kevin kind of hit on it, right? Like, some of our data that comes in or we have stored in our repositories are either non-standard or need to be standardized in some way, right? And I never thought when I was like a 10-year-old that I would be like, geeking out over the fact that I could apply some sort of method to bring standardization and, reduce the entropy of a data set so that we could put it somewhere. Like, that wasn't, I want it to be like a race car driving soccer player, like every other kid on the planet, I think. But there's a lot of those sorts of activities that are they're low-hanging fruit in that they become they allow us to enable downstream applications pretty significantly, like whether it be a already pre-existing dashboard that somebody's built that we can now standardize data into and bring a whole new data set into it, or whatever that may be. So like, that's usually the example that I go to, because that's honestly a lot of the work that I do is in wrangling and cleaning and making data standard so that it can fit into an existing pipeline. And then, then we get to do the really fun stuff after that. Kevin?
Yeah, I think I don't know, like Rachel, were you looking for like a,
I guess I was just like trying to look at like a specific example, or like a person across the organization, or not like the specific person, but like, what were they doing before and how did you make things easier for them?
Yeah, I think I saw something in the chat where someone's, anyone who's using Excel in any organization, if they're doing repetitive tasks in Excel, those are always low-hanging fruit examples where, if they have the time to get over the learning curve of using R or Python to do whatever they're trying to do, I'm sure they can do it better, using better tools.
Right. So I missed the specificity part of it, I guess. I guess a recent one was we got an external request for some data that was on the FDA.gov page. And the person that sent us the request was, I think, an economics grad student somewhere, and they had made this request, and they were like, they're like, the way that the data is stored, which was stored as flat PDF files, they're like, it's going to take us forever to get this data out, to actually do something with it. And so I checked with my supervisor, the CDO. I checked with my boss, and I was like, hey, can I, I'm just going to do this for them real quick. And he's like, okay, fine. And so I was able to convert those things from flat PDFs and send them back to them as CSVs, which is what they were looking for. They were asking for essentially database calls. And I was like, well, I can extract these, convert them, and send them back. And in their note, I kind of found it a little shocking and surprising. They were like, we want to do some complex analytics around this thing. They're like, this will take us hundreds of hours to do. And I was like, I can do this in an hour. So we took care of that and moved that along, which again, that's an answer to somebody, to Russ, who was asking about who our customers can be. They can be external partners as well. And if the request comes in through a channel that we can handle, and it's something that, I'm not saying everybody will get an answer in an hour, right? But it's like, this was one that we could, enable an external partner who could do some work to do some work.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. I see, Nathan, you had asked a question a bit earlier about the data science development program. Do you want to jump in and ask that?
Yes, sorry. You all mentioned earlier sort of that I think there was some stuff on the website about your approach, or I'm just curious, as I'm with MedStar here in DC, as we're undertaking sort of the same talent identification, upskilling, if you guys have published anything or any suggestions or thoughts as we sort of dig deep into our analyst pool and figure out how we take them on the same journey.
Yeah, we presented about this at the ODT symposium, which happened in mid-December of 2023, and I'll see if it was a recorded process, but I can give you a quick breakdown of how we do it. So we started off with a pilot, and we actually used our existing data science community to reach out to individuals that they thought would be good members of the pilot to provide us with feedback on our process. But essentially what we have applicants do, we actually take an application pool, and we use the existing FDA data science community to review these applicants. And I think at the last application set, we had something like 200 or 168 or some large number of people that had interest. So we bring them in, we look at them, and one of the big things that we look for is we look to see what their perceived value of these skills is for them to the specific organization or area that they are in within the FDA. And anyone that can articulate that fairly clearly, we usually are they move up the pool, because that's exactly what we're looking for, right? Not people that say, oh, well, I already do all this stuff and I want to hop in with you all, which we're at that point, we're like, you kind of don't need us. You're probably pretty accomplished in reading through package documentation or whatever it is. So we bring these folk in, and we have them we organize them into teams around a project with a mentor. And then before they even hop onto the project itself, we give them 4 weeks ahead of time, and we're experimenting with expanding that 4-week piece out to do a standalone program. But we give them 4 weeks where I walk them through a basic dummy data set that I've created, and we farm it out to the FDA data science communities and the mentors that we select for the program, to then walk them through the basics of R, and then we hand them the project and say, okay, here's the specific project that we want you all to, accomplish, and go forth as a small team with a mentor to guide you to learn. And so that allows us to use the basic, what I like to think about is the basic applied science model of 70-20-10, right? 70% is experiential, where you actually have to put your fingers to the keys and have your code implode. Because we want them to understand that it's not going to be something where they can just write a piece of code and it's going to be magic every single time. Most of the time, they're going to spend their time wondering what this weird error is, or why my data exploded. 20% of it is with relationships with their mentor. So we pick somebody that we find to be a champion for data science, and somebody that we think could really guide people through their learning process. And their job is to essentially help them find answers, not necessarily give them answers, right? So we do a 20% piece there, and 10% we give them formal lessons and lectures, whether that be via like, the R platform, whether it be YouTube, whether it be Stack. Like I'll sometimes just send people like straight up Stack Overflow notes being like, check this out, read this and see if you can understand something in there. And we found that that's pretty successful. And it's, some people will go through it and realize they hate this and they never want to do it again. And that's okay. We want them to at least attempt it, experience it, and realize that it's not for them. Some people will find that they enjoy it, but not enough to continue to script, but they become advocates for data and data related activities at the agency, which is huge, right? They can come in and if somebody says something, they'll be like, well, I tried that in this thing I did and it didn't work out. And here's like, why I didn't think it worked out. And then we find some people that become the next generation or the next cadre of advocates who we then draw back in as mentors to teach the next team of people, and we're trying to build it as a self-feeding mechanism. Was that an answer to your question, whoever asked it?
Absolutely. We've been sort of trying to think around building the exact same thing, so it's helpful to hear that somebody else has gone through the process and at least has something that they feel like is working.
Yeah, and they get a little portfolio piece out of it at the end, right? It's sort of like something they can point to and be like, hey, look, I made that. And it's like, it's kind of a very like fuzzy feeling. And we kind of, and again, I can't stress how wonderful the FDA data science community is. And all these people are always like, I always tell the teams when they're working, I'm like, oh yeah, like, your mentors will hop in with a question, but we add many of the FDA data scientists into that. And it's like, sometimes the answer is posted by somebody or someone will be like, hey, let me help you with that. Let's hop off onto a side call before I even see the question, before some of the mentors even see the questions, which is like, it's because this community wants to advocate and educate and build each other up. And it's kind of delightful.
I love hearing all these examples of community within organizations. And I see some comments in the chat about this sounding amazing and how can people apply to work there too. I did also see in the chat, there was some conversation around the R validation hub, and I thought that could be useful for the team commenting in the chat to share here. I don't know if Anuja, you want to give a little bit of background on what that is?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we were just chatting about how sometimes with open source usage, specifically within a highly regulated space, there is additional challenges layered on top of that with regards to, validation. What is validation? What is an adequate level of validation? And so I'll just quickly plug our validation hub that I'm a part of. This is kind of our bread and butter and what we're trying to develop resources for and solutions for. And so if you're interested in attending our community meetings or just want to get in touch for an additional conversation, please connect with me. And I know that Raju and Kevin, both of you are not specifically within the clinical review space, but I assume that as we move towards modernization, these are challenges that are, translatable across. So, yeah.
And I saw a couple of comments in here about, sorry, Devani, I see that you have your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I was actually caught by surprise a little bit because I thought Anuja was going to talk about how actually using that application is harder to get approval for hosting open source and kind of do all those things, not the validation. Because in my mind, doesn't matter if you're using Excel or any other familiar tool, any process and methodology you end up using, whether it's SAS or whatever, still needs validation. So validation is a uniform across. It's not dependent on the tool. Maybe there's some challenges by doing this in R versus something else. I would say Excel would be hardest to validate, which I think based on some of the examples that were thrown in, it is so easy to change things in there. No source code repositories, anything else like that. So yeah, I was just curious about that and wanted to bring that up. Is like, I was very surprised that validation was the reason why OS was harder.
I guess validation is necessary for any tool or software that you use, to your point, Dhwani, but it's just that open source specifically poses additional challenges that can be a little tough to quantify in some instances.
I wanted to make sure we've reshared that link as well, Anuja, if people are interested in finding it. I know there's so much great conversation happening in the chat there. Tomas,
Rachel, I just wanted to know, because it might be missed on people, but you mentioned people are like interested in applying for jobs. There's a data scientist position posting right now that's I think it's not just FDA. It's like, I don't know, Raju, can you speak to it? What is it?
So it's a government-wide data call for data science applications. So, apply. And essentially it's a mechanism by which the agency is trying to bring in data talent so that then they can be utilized and brought into specific agencies after that process. So it is a somewhat more like it's an intake portal out, and I believe it's open until I saw one this morning that was open until the 24th of November, I think, of this year. Like it's kind of long-standing, and I believe it might be rolling. And I'll look for some additional links and put them in chat for you all.
Awesome. Thank you. Tomas, I see your hand raised. Want to jump in here?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the previous the validation issue. I think what we have to deal with is that that validation space is not rational, and very often if we called open source, if we didn't call it open source, if we called it something else, maybe there would be less issues with the validation, because right now we kind of delegate the validation to whoever the developer is. And I don't think that the SaaS developers are more reliable than the SaaS developers don't have emotional investment in the application, right? You very often can't get to them and all that. So I think some of it is just behavioral science. We have to kind of change the narrative and make people understand where the validation truly is necessary. And then with Excel, I think that's a great example. Like you can, Excel may be validated, but then a lot of the effort that you do in Excel is coming from the people's brain. So what are you going to validate there? So and by the way, the Validation Hub is doing excellent work. And I was involved for a little bit with a couple years ago, and that was a really interesting experience.
Thank you. I can't believe how, I always say this, but I can't believe how quickly this time is going by. And I know there's so many more questions too. But Eric, I see you have your hand raised. Want to jump in next?
Yeah. Just a quick kind of question back for Tomas. So I definitely agree that when the software is actually getting developed, it's the same sort of effort that goes into open source for SaaS and things like that. But I wonder if one difference is with the SaaS being a company and everything, there's like the financial accountability if something goes wrong. So a company can kind of look towards if something goes wrong, and open source is missing that. So maybe that's a distinction. I don't know if you think that's accurate.
I guess it is. I just haven't. I think we don't have. We don't have enough examples of failure to really assess that. It's all sort of hypothetical. Like I've never heard of our application failing in some substantial, because it's propagated by sort of, it's like the Reddit upvotes. If a package gets successful enough, there's a reason for that. That's kind of an evolutionary reason, and sometimes that's not how the development works in software companies. They look at the market and develop what they think could add value to their product. With the open source, it's the utility. It's some person really needs this and develops it to the T. So I think that's the irrationality of the space, that we don't really have good examples of failure.
It's a must. I just want to add, I think for validation, like you were saying, there are cases where validation is more important or less important, right? Because the consequences are bigger or smaller, right? And that's where I think that feeds into what we were saying before about, like the efficacy, statistical analysis of efficacy of drugs, like that's like very critical, and that can come. It's a pre-specified plan, and it can come down to like millions and billions of dollars on the line about how a p-value turns out, right? And those cases, like validation is obviously super important, right? But in these other cases where it's like, I'm doing this task that I could do 1,000 times faster, as one step in a step with 1,000 steps that all have the potential for some error to leak in. But like, that's life, you know, like those kinds of tasks, those kinds of things, those are the opportunities where we're having a lot more traction with data science, because it's not, the questions about validation aren't as, you know, it's not like you were saying, it's not rational to apply high standards of validation to every single step we take, you know. Raju.
You have your hand raised too.
Yeah, and I'm gonna kind of dovetail that a little bit into some of the questions in here about, like, you know, like, I guess, validation of packages and how do we do it and all this fun stuff, right? And so it's actually a pretty fun debate that I get to have as part of the hat I wear from the scientific computing board for the agency, where we get to talk to the like the FDA IT infrastructure folks and the FDA IT, like, you know, enterprise management folk about, you know, how we do one thing or another. And so, like, you know, we always talk about, you know, community-based validation and management versus, like, you know, security and the security folk doing their, like, review and management and all that fun stuff. And honestly, the best solution that we have right now is that the security team do validate those packages, and if they have any interesting questions, they reach out to the scientific computing board, myself or Jamie Pettingill, and then we're able to either route the question or route the answer and find a solution. So that is one of the activities that we do undertake, and it comes down to, you know, one, I can reach out to my friends in the FDA data science community to help provide additional insight as needed, but we have our IT InfoSec folk really paying attention, and they are paying attention because they care about it as well, which is kind of awesome because they work with us to enable what we need. And if they find a problem or something, they're always willing to share it with us and then explain it to us, which I think is a huge cultural shift that at least I've experienced in the last, you know, however long I've been at the agency, which has been great.
Awesome. Let me go quickly through a few questions here. I see Payam, you asked about some of the other open source tools. Do you want to jump in? And I can.
Yes, thank you. Just quickly, what are some of the other tools, or no, do you guys recommend at work for automation, dashboarding, infrastructure, anything?
Like I said, we use our Shiny for some of our projects. We also are looking into, like, you know, Dash to do, you know, Python-based development and, you know, just Dash in general. One of the other tools that we use is Nime, for those of you that have ever heard of or used Nime, which has been around for a really long time. Nime is another good one. It's honestly, it comes down to like a day-to-day usage of whatever the best piece of technology is. Like if somebody wants to do if somebody wants to do OCR work, like, you know, they can either chase down a commercial product that exists within their specific organization, or, you know, if they reach out to me, I'm like, hey, have you looked at Tesseract? Like, you know, again, it comes down to what the need is and what they essentially are trying to do with it. And then, you know, we have a whole slew of software and tools that have been essentially, you know, reviewed by the IT organization that we can then, you know, point them towards. And if it's something that's not there, then we talk to them about what it is, why they need it, and then, you know, we help them sort of navigate the process with our InfoSec folk as needed to either get it in or get an answer.
Thanks. Is that list published somewhere on GitHub, for example?
No, our internal list is not published externally. But, you know, it's an interesting question, and I can take that back and ask.
Yeah, I would just add there's an aspect of convenience of, like, you know, if we can do something using Microsoft Office tools like Power BI, because that's installed on everyone's computer, we should do that. R is easier to install at FDA because statisticians use it. There's, you know, so there's a user base for it, so there's already support for it. Whereas Python is a little bit more neat, you know. But we're, you know, we're trying to build. But, you know, it's kind of, that has to do with how, and I'm sure most organizations the same way, that you know, whatever is already available to all your, you know, your organization, if you can do it with that, do it with that, and then, you know, try to advocate to fill the gaps you need. But it's not, so it's not saying R is better than Python, but it's easier to get installed at FDA. It's easier to use here. So we tend to lean towards it, especially for like new data scientists.
Thank you both.
Right as we end here, I want to zoom back out a little bit and just ask you both. I love asking this question. What is one of the most memorable pieces of career advice that you've both either received or given throughout your professional journey?
You want me to go first, Kevin? You got one?
I got one if you need time.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I mean, for me, my career has been built on the old adage of don't ask for permission, beg for forgiveness. Where, I do things that, like if you see the opportunity to do something that's going to add value to your organization or your coworkers or the problem you're trying to solve, like don't ask for permission first, because it takes longer to get permission than it does to just do it. And once you do it and you show people, hey, I did this thing and it's really valuable, they usually just say thank you. And it's easier to explain it after you did it than to try to explain and get permission. And that's been that's been helpful for me.
Love it. Thank you.
That's a really good one. And I'm gonna shout out to a grad student that I worked with, Dr. Callie Versagli, if she ever watches this video. But I mean, this is a piece of advice I've gotten a lot in my life, right? But this one time really stuck with me, where if you see something that you find is a need and it's something that causes you grief or frustration, it's okay to roll up your sleeves and use, Kevin's model of like, ask for forgiveness or whatever you want to do, but roll up your sleeves and actually attempt to make a change, right? Rather than just complaining about it. So, most of the jobs that I've had and most of the tasks that I've gotten at the FDA have been because I'm like, here's a need. How do we resolve that need? Here's a potential solution to that need, and let's see if it works, right? Taking that experimental biologist hat and taking it to like real world problems and actually doing it. So if you see a need and you can find either someone that will help you advocate for it, or you can find some way to solve that problem, or at least help somebody solve that problem, should just lean in and work with it within the bounds of what a human being can accomplish, and don't burn yourself out and all that fun stuff. But just attempt to make a change, I guess.
My other 2 cents motto is all science is data science.
All science is data science. All tasks are data science, right? Even grocery lists.
Thank you both so much. I love Alexis is in the chat as well, to find your community. And just want to say thank you all so much for being here and for spending time with us in this community. And if this was anybody's first time and you want to join us back next Thursday, we are here every Thursday, same time, same place. I'll put the short link in the chat where you can add it to your calendar. But Raju and Kevin, really appreciate you joining us here and sharing your experience. This has been great.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. A quick plug I forgot to do. The call for talks for the POSIT conference in August this year is now open. And so I put a blog post in the chat as well. And hope to see many submissions from you all here, because we'd love to see talks at the conference as well. Have a great rest of the day, everybody.